In December 1991, the USSR officially collapsed, promising a Europe free of communism upon the arrival of the 21st century. This collapse not only brought forth perhaps the most unstable period Europe had known since the Second World War, as the continent pondered the many ways the breakdown of the ex-communist bloc could go wrong, but also perhaps one of the biggest and fastest efforts for privatization of the many industries operated in those countries, now left to fend for themselves in the open markets. The process of privatization that swept the remnants of the shattered USSR and Russia, in particular, were in part promoted by the West, the most logical first step in the country's inevitable transition from authoritarian socialism to something else, perhaps something more akin to the democratic capitalism of the West. Many researchers have written ad nauseum about this event, many agreeing with the generally held notion that it was not successful, and that many of the country's current problems can be traced back to the meddling of interested parties and sheer haste with which it was conducted. Much has been spoken about the oligarchical structure of Russia, but much less has been talked about why it's structured in such a way. The authoritarian tendencies of the inner circle of the Kremlin were certainly not a new effect born out of the greed that a privatization of the economy inherently implies to those in power. We must not forget that we're talking about a country that had, for over 7 decades, exploited the public sector and enriched themselves with the excuse of communism. The corruption that would spring out of the 90s privatization efforts is therefore a reminiscence of those early post-revolution years, where the Tsar's wealth and power was up for the taking. The cronyism and corrupt practices that influenced the division of wealth during the birth of modern Russia are therefore an example of failed privatization, as those in power in the past were rewarded with large ownership percentages of companies that would substitute the state in managing the proceedings and economic activity of the nation. But then, why does the standard capitalist model push as many companies as possible towards the privatization path? Are we not in danger to fall into the same trap that Russia did in the twilight of the past century? What if every sector in a country were completely privatized? Those are the questions that we will look at today. Welcome once again to Rebel Economics, and to a new episode of What If, our series where we explore interesting thought experiments on economics and business. Today, we will look at how the world would look if everything were privatized, every sector absolutely independent of the state, beyond paying taxes and following the law, and no individuals working for the state. Could our current understanding of capitalism even bloom and thrive in such a cutthroat world? Or would we all just fall into the post-Soviet era pit of generalized corruption? We will look at all of that today. But first, we're a young channel, and we could use your help by dropping a like if you enjoy the video or even subscribing. So, thank you. Additionally, I recommend you to take a look at our What If playlist, where you can find all of our thought experiment videos, link in the description. You can find out how the world would look if rich people could not inherit any money, or if only robots worked. And as a counter exercise to today's question, what if we all work for the state? So we hope you enjoy. But now, back to the question at hand. What if every sector got privatized? Our thought experiment would originate in a nation after a particularly big corruption scandal, where over 90% of government workers were receiving kickbacks from the government in a sort of massive corruption scheme that singled out the private sector and generated ire in the taxpayers responsible for sustaining such a farce. Soon, as the next election rolled in, a new party was put in charge, one without ties to the previous infrastructure of theft, and put the leaders of the previous corrupt government, as well as everyone else responsible for such corruption, in jail. And, on its second day in office, a president would sign in an order forcing every public sector to privatize immediately. The chambers of Congress and Senate, not wanting to be seen as sympathizers of the preceding kleptocracy, ratified the bill. And so, the next day, the sun rises in a privatized nation, where every sector is held to the standards of the market. No individual receives a salary from the state, and where, if the government needs a job done, will have to purchase the service of a particular private company. Note that this is just an exaggerated example of how this would come to be. Even I don't believe for a second this could work. For 90% of the public sector to be receiving kickbacks and no one noticing would require a country full of blind people. Not to mention that someone would probably uncover the affair eventually. But this is what triggers our event, so let's see how it progresses. One economist that we have talked about in the past in our videos on monopolies, Joseph Schumpeter, can serve as a guide in this brave new world. Schumpeter was a big fan of privatization and the power of the private sector to unlock the human potential at the core of innovative efforts that drop productivity and performance. He believed that a large public sector will have trouble innovating and will lead to complacency of the populace, occupied and protected by it. But even during his most ardent critique of the role of the state in a capitalist economy, he still did not consider it to be a cure for all the ills a country might face. As opposed to some ultra-capitalists who believed that the thought experiment we're analyzing today is a good idea, Schumpeter did believe that there were areas of the economy where the state should take part. He pointed out three in particular. Guarantee the following of the law to all involved parties in an economy, maintaining an army to defend the state from outside threats, and remain in the lookout for monopolies naturally emerging in the economy and break them down. So, even one of the most ardent defenders of small government still found places for the oversized power of the state to be applied, which might bring into question the desirability and even survivability of, for example, state. But what would the benefits be if everything were privatized? Well, the first one would be the one that Schumpeter himself would defend. Governments, he believed, are inherently inefficient economic actors. They miss the big picture almost always and try to trample of the power of free competition inherent to the private capitalist framework. During his lifetime, Schumpeter battled the Keynesian ideals of monetary and fiscal policies promoted by the state to regulate the economy as positive factors of the newly emerging neoclassical capitalist model that we have held even to this day in most places. Schumpeter was terrified of communism and its rapid expansion across the world, so he thought that curtailing the power and size of the state was the key to do so. He put forward arguments that benefit the uber-privatized state, for example, like how individuals being subject to the whims of the labor market are encouraged to develop new skills and remain constantly on the lookout for better salary and education opportunities. This is a benefit that public sectors, by their very nature, as safe havens where once a worker gets in, he's really hard to kick out even if he actually sucks at his job, simply don't generate. Or at least are not equally rewarded as they should be in the private sector. Additionally, Schumpeter believed that competition among companies was the stimulant required to encourage innovation and risk-taking, both keys to a thriving economy. He put forward the thesis that, generally speaking, companies with eternal government contracts that the state could not pull out from or entities directly affiliated to the state would be comparatively less innovative and more risk-averse, therefore leading to a world much more similar to the one we see today, where almost every government service is supplanted by a much better private alternative. For example, consider doing your taxes. Yeah, I know, how can I be bored and terrified at the same time? Certainly an experience, but I mean, consider which software you use. In most countries, the state puts out a general tax software to help people file their taxes, but most of the time, it sucks, being slow and clearly not made for the average Joe to understand. Alternatively, now more and more private tax software has been produced that inherently improves the usability and experience. Plus, it even offers explanations. Why is this? Is it because all the good, kind, and smart people are in the private sector? No. It is because if the existence of your company is predicated on doing better than your competitors, you come up with new ideas, while the state, being much larger and tied down by tradition and tight labor and operational legislation, has a much harder job innovating. An extra benefit that our privatized state would have would be lower taxes. This is quite straightforward. Since we're massively downsizing the size of the public sector, we're also dramatically reducing the capital required to keep it afloat. Certain expenses like pensions and a select group of politicians who would be the only ones to receive a salary would still have to be paid out. Otherwise, the impact would be great. But what about the duties that the state must undertake? Like fixing roads, for example. Well, these things will remain as they are now, with the government signing contracts with private companies to get those jobs done, but with one difference. Each contract will have to be held to the utmost competitive standard, whereby they are given based on a strict comparative analysis of the benefit of each participant, and no undesirable policies like contract tailoring to a specific company are conducted. So, those are the benefits of a privatized state. But what about the demons that legislators and the citizens of such state will have to battle? What are the Achilles heels of such an economic structure? To uncover them, let's look back at the minimal 3 areas of government intervention that even Schumpeter defended, starting with defending the law. Not to get too much into politics, but a government that does not have sovereignty over the application of the law, be it because it lacks a police force or a judiciary sector, or because, like in our case, the individuals working in those positions are actually working for a third-party company, is a lot of trouble. Crucial sectors to a country are nationalized for a reason. Generally, the reason is that if they were to be left in the hands of a private company, no matter how kind-hearted and patriotic its board might be, it could compromise the security or even the existence of a country. Consider, for example, the second of Schumpeter's areas of public affairs, the army. Imagine that our example country would render army from a weapons company that also offered trained officials and infantry. This is a very clear weak point that perhaps a foreign power might use to weaken the country, perhaps by bribing the board of the company so that they will refuse to fulfill the contract signed with the state in their moment of need. The third and final of Schumpeter's argument for the state to intervene is to break down monopolistic entities that naturally develop in markets with free competition. We talked about Schumpeter, monopolies, and how to break them in our other video, which you can watch after this one. But here it suffices to say that some companies will inherently gain too much power in a competitive market, so much so that the power of smaller competitors will get diminished, as the monopolistic power crushes or acquires them before they can endanger their existence. Schumpeter believed that it was the role of the state to remain on the lookout for these entities and develop antitrust legislation to bring them into line and allow innovators to emerge and actively compete against them in somewhat of an equal footing. Perhaps the greatest danger that our uber-competitive private state would face would be the natural emergence of monopolies and large conglomerates that would dominate the market. Because then, all of the benefits we mentioned in the previous sections, like innovation, a better educated workforce, and cheaper products, will get diminished, as the monopolistic entities carve out their place in the market, without leaving room for anyone else to compete fairly, and then start raising their prices and offering worse products, as it is the nature of undisturbed, overpowerful entities. And that's about it. An over-privatized country might be able to enjoy the fruits of the untethered competition and the enhanced innovation that derives from it. But what this essay has shown, just like Schumpeter did in the previous century, is that there is such a thing as too much competition. The state, even if it is an inefficient economic actor, should remain at the helm of some of the industries of the economy, or risk the aforementioned dangers of security and monopolistic entities emerging. Thank you for watching Rebel Economics and our new What If series. We have a playlist with all of our What If videos on robots, inheritance, and working for the state. Additionally, I recommend you to check out our Amazon video on how the giant online retailer abuses its sellers. Please consider liking and subscribing if you enjoy the content, and I will see you in the next video.